Hello and welcome to the RSNA Special Interest Group on 3D Printing's first webinar of the 2022 year. Thank you to Dr. Kiarashi and Dr. Prima for being with us today and walking us through FDA's recently released discussion paper on 3D printing medical devices at the point of care. This is FDA's initial outline for a possible regulatory approach, and to me represents a very important milestone. Many interactions between the public and the FDA over the last years have led to this moment, including a well-attended workshop that is hard to believe was 8 years ago in 2014, and many others, including a joint RSNA and FDA meeting on anatomic models in 2017. Many questions still remain, and this will be a great discussion of this discussion paper today. I'll take a few minutes to talk about the RSNA and the special interest group before introducing the speakers. As a note, you can be posting questions at any point during the webinar through the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll be taking questions after the presentation. So let me talk just a little bit about RSNA. Many people would know RSNA as a leading and large group organization of over 52,000 members focused on radiology and focused on research and education. The special interest group within the RSNA on 3D printing was founded about 5 years ago, and its purpose is really to focus on medical applications of 3D printing, and specifically in a point of care setting. We're also seeking to provide others with education and research programs. There's more information with the QR code below on the special interest group and joining RSNA. Whether you are in radiology or not, there is a pathway for joining. The leadership this year, my name is Andy Christensen. I'm pleased to be chair for 2022 of the SIG, followed by the vice chair, Nicole Wake, our secretary, Lumari Santiago, our treasurer, Beth Ripley, and our liaison to the Radiology Informatics Committee of the RSNA, Ken Wang. One thing to point out today, just because it's very current relating to the SIG, is that we have subcommittees that we're just kicking off again for the calendar year 2022. Kickoff meetings and leaders are shown here. So this is more information you need, but if you're interested in one of these four subcommittees within the SIG, I would say please check the SIG community page for the details and the links to join these kickoff meetings and see how you can be involved in our group. Another important point to note is that the SIG is hosting its first ever CME course that will be held in Chicago, April 22 to 24. And this is going to be a great time to get together with peers and share insights and see the latest from vendors. This meeting registration will open in about 2 weeks, February 1st, and this link on the left will take you to that. Also through rsna.org/3D-printing, and we're excited about that meeting. So today, let's get moving on to the topic of the day. We're joined by Dr. Nooshin Kiarashi and Dr. Matthew Prima, both from the FDA. They both had long careers with the FDA and have a bit of a focus specifically in additive manufacturing and advanced manufacturing. I will let you read some of their details here. I'm really pleased. I think this group within the FDA has really, over many years now, been a very open and collaborative group. And I would like to, personally, again, thank Dr. Kiarashi and Dr. Prima for sharing their insights today on this recently released discussion paper. So with that, I will turn it over to Matthew to share.
All right, well, thank you so much, Andy, and for the RSNA for hosting us. And we are really excited to talk about our discussion paper. So real quick, we have our standard disclaimer. If we happen to mention any products or their sources, that's not to be construed as an endorsement by FDA or Department of Health and Human Services. And then we have a special one for this discussion paper. So it's really important for us to emphasize that what we're presenting really is a discussion paper. It's meant to facilitate input from groups outside the agency. And as such, this should not be construed as policy or guidance. So the things we're talking about certainly are not ready to be implemented and have not been implemented. So real quick, and I'm so happy that Andy put up the QR code with the link to the discussion paper. It was published in the second week of December. We're presenting 16 questions to a range of stakeholders about this sort of conceptual regulatory framework that we are presenting. The docket is open through February 8th. We have the link here. I highly encourage everyone to submit their feedback to the docket. Ideally, we would like really detailed and amazing answers to all 16 questions, but feel free to answer as many or as few of the questions as you can. And even if you have just sort of general feedback about the sort of concept, that's also welcome. Because again, we're really looking to hear from the stakeholders about what you like or don't like about the framework. So the scope of this, and it's really important to emphasize, is that this is really limited to what FDA looks at for medical devices. So these are going to be medical device products regulated within the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And it's going to exclude drugs, biologics, everything that's been underlined here. And when it gets to combination products, again, we're only going to be really considering the device portion of that. We do have a couple of sort of proposed definitions that are important to understand the concept. So the first one's going to be the healthcare facility. So I think the easiest way to think of this is going to be the facility where the care is being provided. Again, we have a number of different types of cares and some other language pulled from some of the different FDA regs. But the other really important thing is when we're talking about healthcare facility, we're not just talking about the clinicians. We're also talking about the engineers, the research staff, the people hired and working directly for that facility. We then have the point of care, and this is certainly open to discussion, but we want to differentiate the location where the care is occurring versus sort of who owns that space. But again, this could be a range of different facilities. It's important to notice often we'll talk about hospitals, but we're open to other locations beyond a traditional hospital setting, such as the physician's office or even like a dental or ambulatory surgical facility. And then the other big term for us to discuss is what we're calling the medical device production system. People who saw some of the earlier presentations saw what we're calling like a turnkey system. So this term actually comes from it's called the IMDRF. So that's the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. They came out with a paper sort of talking about this concept, and we liked it, so we borrowed their term. And the key thing here is that this includes the final product as well as the raw material, the software workflow, and all of the hardware needed to produce that product. So it can be very easy to get confused when you hear MDPS and think, oh, it's just the printer and the system. But this also includes that product that's being produced. So we do have a couple of key concepts for this framework. So the first one is that we really want this to be a risk-based approach. And we want to take into account the risk of both the product being printed as well as the printing technology and any associated risks based on the location. So having mentioned the location, we want to make sure that the performance of the product doesn't change based on the location. The best way to think about this is a patient shouldn't have to wonder, if this product was printed at the hospital or traditional manufacturing location, because the performance and the quality of that product isn't going to change based on that. Now, part of that is we are acknowledging that there are capabilities at a point of care healthcare facility that can help mitigate some of these production risks. Right? There's already a lot of oversight, training, and experience that can be leveraged to, again, reduce the risk. Now, having said that, it's important that the entity should understand their and others' responsibilities. There's a lot of regulatory requirements in device manufacturing, and we don't want there to be any confusion or ambiguity about who's responsible for what, because that's generally when problems occur. So one of the key points of this discussion paper, as we lay out these different sort of options, is to make sure people understand what their expectations are and their requirements under the Food or the Device Act to make sure that patient health isn't compromised at all. And that sounds pretty intimidating. So we also want to circle back and say, there are, again, existing controls at the point of care that we think we can leverage to reduce some of this burden to ensure that these innovative activities can still go on and patients can get the best care possible. So this is the high-level framework, and I'm about to turn this over to my colleague Nooshin to sort of talk through this in a little bit more detail. Again, people who saw some of the previous discussions will notice we went from sort of 5 scenarios to 3. Really, this was sort of a condensing of the concepts. So scenario 1 is healthcare provider using the medical device production system. Previously, this would have been scenarios B and C, where we had a turnkey system and a turnkey, we'll say, plus. But here, the important thing to emphasize is that the traditional manufacturer is the one who's designing and developing the device. The healthcare facility is going to be the end user of this MDPS, and the regulatory sort of responsible entity is going to be the traditional manufacturer, with the healthcare provider or healthcare facility being the end user. For scenario 2, this is the co-location. This is going to be the most similar to what we previously discussed. So here, a traditional manufacturer is going to co-locate. The traditional manufacturer is going to be the one sort of using the systems at the point of care. And the traditional manufacturer, because they are making their product in their facility that happens to be co-located, is the one who's going to be ultimately responsible. So scenario 3, so this covers the healthcare provider facility assuming the responsibilities of the manufacturer. Now, if you notice, scenario A seems to have disappeared, but scenario A turned into a very low risk activity, and that is sort of nested under the healthcare provider assuming all the responsibilities. So now that I've provided a very high level overview of this, I'm going to turn it over to Nooshin to talk through these scenarios in more detail.
Thank you, Matthew. I would like to mention how Matthew has been very instrumental in shaping this effort and getting this discussion paper published. And I'm really glad to be able to present along with Matthew to RSNA this time around. So I'll be walking you through these scenarios with slightly more detail now and provide some examples. After that, I will go over the questions posed in the discussion paper and how you can submit your feedback. So the first scenario in the discussion paper is for healthcare facilities using a 3D printing medical device production system, MDPS, where the MDPS manufacturer assumes responsibilities for FDA regulatory requirements and manufacturing of the devices printed by the healthcare facility using the MDPS. In this situation, the point of care 3D printing facility within the healthcare facility uses a medical device production system to 3D print devices covered by the MDPS. Generally, in a situation like this, the responsibility for FDA compliance lies with the manufacturer of the medical device production system. And the point of care 3D printing facility within the healthcare facility is considered a user of the medical device production system. So in brief, in this scenario, the entity designing the device is a traditional manufacturer. The entity using the 3D printing system is the healthcare facility, and the entity responsible for complying with regulatory requirements is the traditional manufacturer. For healthcare facilities, it is important to understand the risks related to 3D printing generally and the risks related to the particular 3D printed device when using a medical device production system. In addition, it is important for healthcare facilities to consider the potential risks if they use the medical device production system inconsistent with the labeling and intended use. On the other side, for the medical device production system manufacturers, if it is consistent with the FDA's submission bundling policy, one marketing submission could be used for multiple raw materials, scanners, or printers. And post-processing information would be very important to include in the marketing submission for FDA review and for labeling. Let's consider an example of scenario 1. A traditional manufacturer received a 510(k) clearance for a 3D printing medical device production system that makes patient-matched anatomic skeletal models used to assist in a physician's surgical planning procedures and during the surgery itself. The 510(k) cleared medical device production system includes or references in the labeling a compatible scanner, design and manufacturing software, design limitations coded into the software, raw materials, compatible printers, and associated tooling. A healthcare facility uses this cleared 3D printing medical device production system in accordance with its labeling. This constitutes an example of scenario 1. Now moving on to the scenario 2 that is provided in the discussion paper. Scenario 2 is when traditional manufacturers are on or near the healthcare facility site. In this situation, the healthcare facility itself does not engage in any 3D printing activities. Instead, the healthcare facility develops a business relationship with a traditional manufacturer where the traditional manufacturer, including their contract manufacturer, is co-located on or near the healthcare facility site, which is the point of care. And as part of this relationship, the co-located 3D printing facility provides the healthcare facility with 3D printed devices. In this situation, the traditional manufacturer is responsible for compliance with FDA's regulations. So in brief, in this scenario, the entity designing the device is a traditional manufacturer, and the entity using the 3D printing system and responsible for complying with regulatory requirements is the traditional manufacturer, including their contract manufacturer. It is worth noting that the 3D printing that occurs at these co-located manufacturing sites may be specific to patient need, and such patient-specific changes to an already authorized device could require a new submission to FDA. And we have guidance documents to refer to determine if a new marketing submission would be required. Now, let's look at an example of scenario 2. Let's say a traditional manufacturer has 510(k) clearance for a spinal fusion cage. The traditional manufacturer works with the healthcare facility to bring 3D printing to the point of care. The traditional manufacturer leases a physical space within the healthcare facility to 3D print their 510(k) cleared spinal fusion cages at the point of care. The traditional manufacturer uses their own equipment and implements their existing quality system at this device establishment. Another example is when a traditional manufacturer has 510(k) clearance for an intervertebral body fusion device. The traditional manufacturer works with the healthcare facility to use a third party based at the healthcare facility in a point of care 3D printing facility to make an intervertebral body fusion device. So this is an example of a scenario using contract manufacturers. Moving on to scenario 3 in the discussion paper, which is healthcare facilities assuming all traditional manufacturer responsibilities. Excuse me. In this situation, the point of care 3D printing facility within the healthcare facility would not use a medical device production system, and they would not work with a co-located traditional manufacturer to 3D print devices. Instead, the healthcare facility has chosen to engage in the activities of a traditional manufacturer in their point of care 3D printing facility. In this situation, the healthcare facility would be responsible for complying with FDA regulatory requirements for device manufacturing. In brief, in this scenario, the entity designing the device, 3D printing, and also responsible for complying with regulatory requirements is the healthcare facility itself. It's possible that healthcare facilities may have existing policies, procedures, and expertise that would help them engage in manufacturing. And these existing capabilities and expertise may better enable the healthcare facilities to transition to assume all responsibilities of a traditional manufacturer and comply with FDA regulatory requirements. So here's an example of scenario 3. A healthcare facility decides to use 3D printed patient-specific anatomic models to assist physicians' visualization during treatment planning. In the past, the point-of-care 3D printing facility within the healthcare facility has used image analysis, segmentation software, and a 3D printer to retrospectively make physical anatomic models of old surgical cases. From this experience, the point-of-care 3D printing facility knows the accuracy and limits of their imaging, printing, and post-processing workflow. And now the healthcare facility would like to use these patient-specific anatomic models prospectively to plan the treatment of current patients. In this example, they're assuming all responsibilities of a traditional manufacturer. So scenario 3 in the discussion paper, which is for healthcare facility assuming all traditional manufacturer responsibilities, also includes considerations for very low risk devices. Certain devices generally pose very low risk to patients, and the agency is considering whether and how it might be appropriate to provide a level of regulatory flexibility under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act when these very low risk devices are 3D printed at a healthcare facility. What constitutes a very low risk device could be informed by the device's inherent risks and benefits, intended use, and the risks introduced by 3D printing generally and at the point of care. If devices are determined to be very low risk, this may also help determine whether certain devices can be appropriately 3D printed at the point of care. FDA is considering developing a list of important characteristics that would help identify very low risk devices. FDA is seeking stakeholder feedback on the types of considerations, device features, and intended uses that may be important to define the extent of any regulatory flexibility that the agency may choose to exercise over such devices. And stakeholders are encouraged to provide comments and feedback on the examples in the discussion paper under scenario 3. So this was an overview of the potential approach for regulatory oversight of 3D printing devices at the point of care. Again, I think it's worth noting that this is not intended to propose or implement a regulatory policy. This is intended to stimulate discussion, to inform further policy development for an appropriate regulatory approach for 3D printing medical devices at the point of care. And FDA expects to issue draft guidance on this topic after considering public comment on this discussion paper collected through the docket, which I'll explain in a moment. The discussion paper includes questions seeking public comment and feedback, and FDA also welcomes general comments and suggestions regarding 3D printing devices at the point of care outside the proposed questions. Under scenario 1, we have using a medical device production system, there are 4 questions touching on potential challenges for manufacturers and healthcare facilities related to responsibilities and post-processing specifically. What are the shoulds and the shouldn'ts? Under scenario 2, which is co-location, there are 2 questions about considerations of co-locating a manufacturing site at a healthcare facility. Are there particular risks that the manufacturer and the healthcare facility need to be aware of when manufacturing at a healthcare facility site or using devices manufactured that way? Design changes can happen frequently under this scenario. So how do we make sure manufacturers understand their obligations? Under scenario 3, which is healthcare facility as a manufacturer, there are 6 questions to gauge the ability of a healthcare facility to implement FDA's regulatory framework. What are the easiest aspects and what are the greatest challenges? How does FDA ensure safety and effectiveness in the least burdensome manner? And as mentioned, scenario 3 also includes considerations for very low risk devices. There are questions on what factors should be considered and how should they be weighed in to determine very low risk. And also, what best practices or oversight program currently exists that can positively contribute to device safety and effectiveness. And then if FDA determines that it is appropriate to provide a degree of regulatory flexibility, should this approach apply to very low risk devices 3D printed at the point of care by a co-located traditional manufacturer, or only to those devices that are printed by the healthcare facility? Finally, there are 3 general questions on terminology, FDA visibility, and if there are suggestions for any other approach or model which is not considered in the discussion paper. And lastly, stakeholder experience with 3D printing during the COVID-19 pandemic is sought for. So please submit your feedback to these questions throughout this discussion paper and other general comments or suggestions to the docket by February 8th, 2022. To access the docket, please go to regulations.gov and enter docket number FDA-2021-N-1272. You may also review the instructions for submitting comments that are included as an attachment on regulations.gov. And if you submit feedback to the questions, it would be helpful if you identify question numbers where applicable. We look forward to all stakeholders' feedback, and we thank you for your attention, and we thank the RSNA 3D Printing SIG for this opportunity to present the discussion paper and also engage with the community. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kiarashi and Dr. Prima. See if I can get my own video back. That was a great overview of the paper. I had several questions that were answered as you went, so thank you for that. We now have some time for questions. I see some rolling in from the audience, so that's great. And we might as well jump to 1 or 2 of these, and I have some filler questions as needed. So we have a question about, do all comments become public record and publicly searchable?
You have 2 options. The first is you can submit comments anonymously. And then there's also a way to submit private comments. But anything that you submit publicly is going to stay up on regulations.gov.
Okay, great. Let's see, another question is a little more detailed. Would 3D printing of anatomical models for pre-surgical planning using 510K cleared software fall under scenario 1 or scenario 3?
Well, I will say if you are following the instructions for use and using the system that's been validated with, as well as the material that's been validated for that software, that would certainly fall under scenario 1. Now, the second you sort of start going off label, you do end up in that scenario 3 category.
Okay. I have maybe a follow-on question to that relating to kind of the instructions for use. As I think about the MDPS systems and kind of as I see them, maybe they get a little bit more complicated than some of the systems that exist today. Does that instruction, do you see that instruction set growing to be more, kind of a system-based and surrounding kind of workflow and procedures and work instructions and verification and validation? Do you see any of that becoming more prevalent in an MDPS in the future?
So this is where I think we're going to lean on the risk-based approach. And I think it's really going to depend on what that product that's coming out of an MDPS is. Certainly, if you can imagine anything implantable, there's going to be a lot of requirements, and there's going to be a lot of, we'll say, things that have to be locked in to ensure that the point of care staff is producing this product that the sponsor sort of tested and validated, or at least a product representative of that. So I think that would be, anything implantable is going to have a very locked down workflow, very strict instructions that have to be followed. I think if we're looking at anatomic models or external devices, even maybe something in the rehabilitative space where you can have a little bit more flexibility, then some of those requirements may be reduced.
Okay, let's see. We have another question from the audience. It's a little longer, so I'll read it. If these scenarios eventually become draft guidance, would a hospital that follows and meets the eventual regulatory guidance now meet the threshold to be a medical device manufacturer within their respective scenario and produce scenario-specific devices for other institutions? So if one hospital has an MDPS for printing airway anatomic models, could another hospital market, or could that hospital market these models to another hospital? Or do all three of these scenarios have the assumption that the healthcare facility producing the models to deploy the print within the, I guess, singular healthcare facility itself?
So that is something that should be sent to the docket because there's a lot to unpack there. The easiest part of that to answer is if you're in scenario 3 and you are acting as a traditional device manufacturer, you can certainly then sell that product to other hospitals. When you start talking about the MDPS, that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. So as the most complete sort of regulatory requirements around an MDPS come out of Australia, and the Australia regulations say that the end user of an MDPS has to use it to treat their patient. So the Australian model would preclude a hospital from sending that to an external hospital. Now, where the scenario gets perhaps a little bit more interesting is if you're in a hospital system and you're having some sort of hub and spoke model. And that's why I think we are really interested in getting feedback from a range of stakeholders, because we want to make sure that, as this turns into guidance, it's going to be as functional as possible.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, as I'm thinking about that comment, it makes me think that facility that wants to do that could also kind of establish a co-located facility that was its own manufacturer, right? And at that point, if it's a manufacturer standing on its own and it happens to be co-located with the first facility, it could easily sell product to other facilities, maybe if it had a cleared system.
I am really excited to see all the different permutations people end up trying to develop. And again, this is why we want as much feedback as possible to, lead us to the best draft guidance eventually.
Good. All right. So audience, we'll let you keep sending some questions in. I have another one kind of talking about, the full scope of medical devices produced at the point of care, could include things like anatomic models and surgical guides, things like personalized implants, but could also include non-personalized items like implants or other supplies, which could be things like instrument handles or things like nasal swabs that we've seen in the last couple of years. Do you imagine the next logical steps encompass all of those areas, or maybe have a focus on the personalized surgery, personalized medicine kind of portion of this?
That's a really good question. And I think it's really hard for us to predict where things are going. So again, I'm going to lean into, this is why we came out with a discussion paper. There's a lot of business model decisions that the FDA doesn't have a lot of insight in. And I think that's going to honestly drive a lot of the activity. And again, it's one part we're reaching out to everyone through the discussion paper. And I think the other thing is, even once we have the discussion paper out and, potentially some set policy, I think people are going to try to find the right business model for them. And, we want something that has the maximum flexibility, because hospitals are going to have different needs. They're going to have different capabilities. And, in the perfect FDA world, we have a framework that, people will find something that works for them.
Yeah. I knew that would be a question with an answer, an answer with a question. Thanks. One other question, and I think you may say the same thing about this question, but people wonder what at the point of care actually means. And the term in the discussion paper, I believe, is near or at the site of a patient. And I know you're wanting feedback on that, but maybe could you talk to that a little bit, just knowing some of the scenarios that exist for everything from small hospitals with a single facility to hospitals that might have an engineering school close by, or hospitals that have multiple facilities in singular or multiple states. I mean, is there anything there you can share kind of about the thinking beyond behind what actually would cross over from being like a regular medical device company to a point of care facility?
We've had lots of discussion, and at one point we're talking about, I think we had like 4 different levels, and one was the printing's happening at the same floor that the care is being provided. I mean, I don't think anyone should be performing surgery in the same room as a powder bed fusion system, so I think that's a little too close. So we have like on the floor, in the building, then we have like on that campus, and then it was sort of within the system. And I think we've certainly seen, the important work that Walter Reed is doing, where they're supporting a whole range of hospitals, across globally, based out of their 3D printing system. So I think, in one sense, you can say, well, the printing's occurring at a hospital, so that's near point of care, right? But then if they're FedExing it to Germany, right, how does that fit in? So, I think it's really important, and again, fall back to, it's a discussion paper. We're really interested in understanding, the different nuances here. And then you have the question of, well, what happens if you have one hospital printing something for a hospital in a different hospital system? And, that's getting a little bit, I think, beyond what we're aiming for in this discussion paper. But I mean, these are all very sort of important questions to understand. And someone even raised in one of our discussions, well, what happens if you have different quality management systems within a hospital system, right? Like, how does that affect the ability for you to transfer these parts around? So again, I think we are hoping we can sort of get the framework going, and then, I'm sure there's going to be lots of future discussions trying to figure out, either how we draw these lines, or maybe it's more of what additional considerations are there if, you have to move this from one hospital to another.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, you could imagine larger systems too, maybe having a distributed model where, different pieces of the puzzle sit in different facilities because they all don't need every piece of the puzzle from a 3D printing standpoint, technology standpoint. Well, that'll be quite interesting.
And certainly, I think for scenario 3, that's sort of easier to address because you are being treated as a medical device production, or as a manufacturer. I think when we hit scenario 1 with medical device production system, that's when I think some of the nuance gets really important. And I mentioned that definition was from IMDRF, and that's certainly the best definition out there. But I think we're at the point where there's enough flexibility that if what we hear is that definition is a little too strict, we can certainly take a look at things. And again, I mean, that's true for everything we presented. Nothing is set in stone. Everything is very fluid. And if we get a lot of very consistent feedback that we need to look at changing something, I mean, there's no promise that we can make the change, but we're very willing to look at everything.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of other questions, 2 that kind of go together. Maybe I'll kind of merge them. And questions about kind of next steps. And can you give a general timeline for review of the comments and a draft guidance? And then another comment that maybe was about the draft guidance. Yeah. So maybe what do you see? I've seen the FDA move fairly fast in this area from my perspective, but how do you see kind of the next steps after the discussion window kind of closes?
So I've done this a few times. So I think it's going to take us about 3 months to read through the comments, consolidate them, and have a really firm sense of what the feedback was. After that, the timeline gets really fuzzy because we have to take that feedback and see what we can do to implement that into, a draft guidance. So I would not expect the draft guidance to come out this year.
Okay.
That would just be, I think, way too unlikely. But after that, it really depends on how complicated things are, right? If everyone comes back and says, wow, what FDA proposed is perfect, you don't need to make any changes, well, I'd be shocked. But that would be easy, right? If people come back and say, FDA, you need to figure out some way to let us do something else, we're going to have to sit down and work through that.
Yeah, I'm assuming the FDA is used to hearing that they're perfect all the time. So that's common.
For me, and Nooshin, of course.
Maybe a little follow-on question, just in general. How often do final guidance documents get revised? It's just a broad question, maybe FDA-wise. How often does that happen?
That's not one I have a lot of insight into. We do periodically release updates if the science or the understanding has changed. I was on a guidance where we had to add like 2 sentences to better explain something because we thought it was perfect, and then companies were getting very confused. So it really depends on what happens. That being said, these documents are so vetted by the time they go out that they generally don't require immediate revision.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. Let's see, another question. Interesting question from the audience. Does the FDA view billed medical services manufactured at the point of care, such as guides and diagnostic use anatomic models, under the new Category 3 CPT codes, the same as selling a device on the market, or commercialization, I guess? Does marketing that capacity, so that's the question. And then the second question is, does marketing that capacity outside of the hospital play into that delineation?
I was really hoping Nooshin was going to answer that one.
Okay.
I'm not. CPT codes start falling under the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and so that's a little bit outside of the FDA scope. I always get scared of answering anything about marketing because I'm not a lawyer, and that gets kind of sensitive. Now, I will also say, because I'm on an FDA chat right now, we do review guidances every 10 years.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. I guess maybe simplifying that question a little bit for the audience, does it matter, like say you're a company and you're selling a product, you're selling a traditional product, if you give it away or you sell it, does that make any determination of whether you are a medical device manufacturer that's putting something into commercial distribution?
So the better way to think of it is our regulatory authority comes out of the Interstate Commerce Clause. So if it's going into sort of interstate commerce, then we have, the authority over it. And that has been interpreted very broadly to also refer to the raw materials that the product is being made out of. So strictly speaking, we could have authority over it. Again, however, I want us to sort of lean back to that very low risk concept where we're willing to have some regulatory flexibility for some of these products.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we'll move on from that rabbit hole a little bit. So talking about that regulatory flexibility and very low risk devices, how do you see that relating to devices that may already be on the market and have some other classification? I mean, I'm sure it gets quite complex, but I mean, do you see this falling into like enforcement discretion or potential down classification? because to me, the challenging part is that you're also balancing the capabilities of the healthcare facility itself as probably helping determine what is a low risk device, because a device made by one facility may be low risk, a device made by another facility, the same device made by another facility with less capabilities, maybe not low risk. But do you have any comments on that?
So I think down classification would be tricky, because that would sort of cover everyone making that product. I think, the best way to think about it is, it's a two-part check. So you look at the device or product you're looking at making, and you say, okay, could it fall into this very low risk category? And in the discussion paper, we had some sort of, rough ideas of what that could be. And in the future, hopefully we'd have some sort of rubric everyone could go through. So then you say, yes, this product could be low risk. And then the question is does your facility have the ability to make it, right? Does it need to be printed on a certain kind of printer? What sort of training or other considerations would you have? So it's tricky, because right now it's a little bit more nebulous, but we want there to be the space for people to, engage with the technology and provide innovative care to patients when we don't see there being a risk to the patients. Very early on, we tried to go through like all the class 1 exempt products to see if we could come up with a list, and that didn't go very well, because there's a lot of, this is really hard, and it depends, the classic FDA response. So I think right now it would be easier for FDA with our stakeholders to come up with a list of criteria, and then let people sort of figure it out sort of in a case-by-case basis. Now, the other part to that regulatory flexibility is if something goes wrong, FDA can always step in and ensure corrective actions are taken. And if we go the down classification route, that gets a lot harder. So we want to sort of maintain the ability to go in and make sure hospitals can correct things if they go wrong. Ideally, they won't, but we want to be very sort of sensitive to having a robust framework that lets people engage in this space without presenting any risks to patients.
Okay, thank you. All right, another question from the audience. Do any of the 3 scenarios specifically address parts of an MDRF that rely on contractors to provide authenticated materials and GMP medical device manufacturing services? Would those material and fabrication service providers need to seek FDA approval to offer distributed services? I guess like a contract manufacturer, maybe.
All right, so there are a couple of different ways contract manufacturers could get involved. So, I think the easiest one is if they're co-located and they're making the product for the device manufacturer. Now, if this is a contract manufacturer doing work for the hospital, I think then it's going to really fall under scenario 3, and then it's going to depend a lot on what the product is. That being said, FDA has a lot of experience dealing with contract manufacturers. There's a lot of information already in guidances and on our website about how contract manufacturers need to interact with device manufacturers. So in many ways, I anticipate that's going to be the same as what we generally see.
Okay. All right, thanks for that. Let's see, we have another question that maybe I will add to a little bit. And it's the question is, do you anticipate scenario 1 hospitals needing to register with the FDA? So that's the first question.
So we have a very specific question about sort of FDA's insight and sort of understanding of what people are doing. And I don't think we have a solid answer for that. As we presented, we were saying, you're going to be the end user. Well, most end users don't need to register and list. However, in talking to a lot of the industry, they're very nervous about giving hospitals, a MDPS and letting the hospitals run it on themselves, run it sort of without oversight. So I think ultimately there's going to have to be some mechanism of getting that oversight, whether that's some sort of accreditation of the hospital, whether the industry sends their own people, or the producer of the MDPS sends their own people to the hospital to handle things. And the other part, and this is a little separate from registration and listing, there's going to have to be some connection between the producer of the MDPS and the hospital, because that manufacturer of the MDPS is going to be on the hook for any adverse events. So there's going to have to be a lot of back and forth. So it is conceivable that we get enough stakeholders across the board saying that they think MDPS users need to register and list, or there could be other options that sort of fill that criteria. So when I say that, like, we're very open to discussion, I think this is a perfect example of it, because we generally have an idea that people have to have confidence that the end users are using this equipment properly. We just don't have, I'll say, a preferred avenue of doing that.
Yeah, I think it's quite an interesting area, and obviously the FDA probably doesn't want to have, the good and the bad. You don't want another thousands of people to kind of look over if you don't have to. But I wonder if maybe, if the manufacturer of the system, and providing training, and maybe they'll obviously know who owns their system, and maybe some kind of post-market surveillance almost that falls on them, because they, like you said, are kind of ultimately responsible from a complaint handling and reporting standpoint. Okay, yeah, interesting. Let's see. So another question that's come in is it expected that between draft guidance and final guidance, the FDA will host other meetings for stakeholders to solicit additional feedback?
Oh, I anticipate even before the draft guidance, there's going to be a lot more stakeholder interaction. This is, I'll say, very complicated, and there's a lot of intricacies. I mean, we just touched on, one part of MDPS is what's that relationship going to look like between the end user and the manufacturer of that system. So there's certainly going to be a lot more interactions on the subject.
Good. Well, yeah, I think everyone will appreciate that. I think, the docket and submitting comments and answering questions will be a good way for people to communicate with you. But some of these instances where you can kind of communicate in a live format are also really, really valuable, obviously. Let's see. I think we're maybe nearing the end of questions. Are there other things that we didn't cover that you've kind of found interesting maybe to bring up before we bring our meeting to a close today?
Well, I've certainly hogged answering all the questions, so I'm happy to have Nooshin give her final thoughts.
I certainly appreciate everyone's attention and this opportunity that the SIG leadership proactively invited us to, be able to have this platform to share the discussion paper. And it's very important to, again, emphasize this is not policy yet, it's not guidance yet, and we're trying to collect feedback, all of these intricacies, the complex scenarios that you all can come up with. We really look forward to the feedback. Please check the docket, submit your comments, and we really appreciate that. We look forward to it, and I think I was just really thankful for Matthew to be joining me in this discussion, because nobody could handle the questions better than Matthew. So I just stayed silent and let him take it away, because he has all the insight and he's been dealing with this effort for a long time. So I guess that's it for me, and we look forward to the feedback.
Yeah, well, thank you again. I would say on behalf of the entire 3D printing special interest group and the leadership, we'd like to thank you both for being with us today and sharing this information. I think it's great timing wise that we could do this and give people more of a glimpse into the background for the paper before the docket kind of closes for kind of official comments. I would urge everyone to mark a deadline in their calendar for February 7th, just to make sure your comments get kind of counted. The link on the right, the QR code on the right, is again for that paper and for the comment area on the left. If you're interested in more information on this 3D printing special interest group, that is a link there also. So with that, I will say thank you again and good day.
Thank you, Andy.